Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her childhood bedroom, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Montana landscape. Today marked her 18th birthday, but instead of celebration, a heavy weight pressed against her chest. The suitcase on her bed held everything she owned in this world, which wasn't much. 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, a worn Bible, and the silver locket her mother had given her before the fever took her life 2 years ago. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, had made arrangements that would change her life forever. Sarah was to be married to Jacob Whitehorse, a Modoc man she had never met. The arrangement troubled her, not because of Jacob's heritage, but because she knew nothing about the man who would become her husband. Her father spoke of him only in practical terms. He was a widower with twin children, he owned land near the reservation, and he needed a wife to help care for his family. The sound of wagon wheels on gravel announced Jacob's arrival. Sarah's heart hammered as she descended the wooden stairs, her hand gripping the banister for support. Through the front window, she caught her first glimpse of the man who would be her husband. Jacob Whitehorse was tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the morning light. His face carried the weathered look of someone who spent his days working the land, but his eyes held a gentleness that surprised her. Thomas Mitchell stepped onto the porch, his weathered hand smoothing his best shirt. He had aged considerably since his wife's death, and Sarah knew the burden of caring for her had worn him down. The drought had destroyed most of their crops, and the debts kept mounting. This arrangement would solve his financial troubles while ensuring Sarah had a home and protection. Jacob climbed down from his wagon with careful movements, his eyes meeting Sarah's briefly, before he turned to address her father. The 2 men shook hands, and Sarah noticed how Jacob's grip seemed firm but respectful. He wore clean clothes and his hair was neatly trimmed, suggesting he had taken care with his appearance for this important day. The conversation between the men was brief and formal. Jacob asked about Sarah's health, her ability to work, and whether she could read and write. Her father answered honestly. She was strong, capable of cooking and sewing, and had completed her schooling through the 8th grade. Jacob nodded at each response, his expression remaining neutral throughout the exchange. When Jacob finally approached Sarah, he removed his hat and spoke softly. His voice carried a slight accent that she found strangely comforting. He told her his name and asked if she understood what this arrangement meant. Sarah nodded, unable to find her voice. He explained that his children, Mary and David, were 6 years old and needed a mother's care. His own mother helped when she could, but she was growing frail and couldn't manage 2 active children alone. The wedding ceremony took place in the small church where Sarah had attended services since childhood. Reverend Johnson performed the brief service with only Thomas Mitchell and Jacob's mother, Elena Whitehorse, as witnesses. Elena was a small woman with kind eyes and hands that spoke of years of hard work. She had brought a simple bouquet of wildflowers for Sarah, a gesture that brought tears to the young bride's eyes. After the ceremony, Sarah said goodbye to her father. The parting was more difficult than she had expected. Despite his practical nature and the financial pressures that had led to this arrangement, Thomas Mitchell loved his daughter. He pressed a small purse of coins into her hand and whispered that she should write to him when she could. Sarah promised she would, though she wondered when such an opportunity might arise. The journey to Jacob's homestead took most of the afternoon. The wagon traveled through rolling hills dotted with cattle and horses, past streams that ran clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Jacob spoke little during the trip, but he pointed out landmarks and explained the boundaries of his property. Sarah learned that he owned nearly 200 acres, much of it grazing land for his small herd of cattle. As they approached the house, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. The home was larger than she had expected, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney and she could see curtains in the windows, suggesting a woman's touch in the household management. Elena Whitehorse met them at the front door, and Sarah realized that Jacob's mother had been caring for the house and children in anticipation of her arrival. The older woman welcomed Sarah warmly, speaking in a mixture of English and her native language. Her smile was genuine, and Sarah felt some of her anxiety begin to ease. The house interior was simple but clean and comfortable. The main room contained a large stone fireplace, a dining table, and several chairs. Sarah noticed hand-woven rugs on the wooden floors and pottery that suggested Elena's artistic skills. Everything appeared well-maintained and organized, though she could see signs that children lived here, a wooden toy horse near the fireplace and small shoes by the door. Jacob showed her to what would be her room, a modest space on the second floor with a single window overlooking the front yard. The room contained a bed, a dresser, and a small chair. Clean linens lay folded on the bed, and Sarah realized that Elena had prepared the space for her arrival. The gesture touched her deeply, as it suggested that Jacob's family wanted her to feel welcome rather than simply filling a necessary role. That evening, Sarah met Mary and David Whitehorse. The twins were shy at first, hiding behind their grandmother's skirts and stealing glances at their new stepmother. Mary had her father's dark hair but lighter eyes, while David favored his grandmother's smaller build. Both children appeared healthy and well cared for, though Sarah noticed a sadness in their expressions that suggested they still mourned their mother's loss. Elena prepared a meal of venison stew, fresh bread, and vegetables from the garden. The family ate together at the large wooden table, with Jacob asking the children about their day and Elena sharing stories about her garden. Sarah listened carefully, trying to understand the family dynamics and find her place within them. She noticed that Jacob was patient with his children, answering their questions and listening to their concerns with genuine attention. After dinner, Elena helped Sarah unpack her few belongings while Jacob spent time with Mary and David. The older woman explained some of the household routines and showed Sarah where supplies were kept. She spoke about her late daughter-in-law with affection, describing Anna as a kind woman who had loved the children deeply. Elena made it clear that she didn't expect Sarah to replace Anna, but hoped she would find her own way to love and care for the family. As night fell, Sarah stood again at a window, this time looking out at unfamiliar territory that was now her home. The responsibilities ahead seemed overwhelming. Caring for two grieving children, managing a household, and building a relationship with a husband she barely knew. Yet something in the day's events gave her hope. Jacob had been respectful and kind. His mother had welcomed her warmly, and the children, though shy, had not rejected her presence. Sleep came slowly that first night in her new home. Sarah listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and the distant call of night birds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust Jacob and his family had placed in her. She clutched her mother's locket and whispered a prayer for strength and wisdom in the days ahead. Sarah woke to the sound of children's laughter drifting through her window. Sunlight streamed across her unfamiliar room, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory rushed back. The wedding, the journey, her new family. She dressed quickly in one of her simple dresses and made her way downstairs, following the sounds of activity. In the kitchen, Elena was preparing breakfast while Mary and David sat at a small table, sharing stories about a family of rabbits they had spotted near the garden. The children's voices carried the musical quality of childhood, innocent and bright. When they noticed Sarah, their conversation stopped, and they watched her with curious eyes. Elena smiled warmly and handed Sarah a cup of coffee, the steam rising in delicate spirals. The older woman began showing Sarah around the kitchen, explaining where everything was kept and describing the family's usual meals. Jacob preferred simple food, she explained, and the children enjoyed sweet things when available. Sarah listened carefully, understanding that learning these preferences would help her find her place in the household. Jacob appeared as they finished breakfast, having already completed the morning chores with the livestock. His clothes smelled of hay and fresh air, and Sarah noticed how the children's faces brightened when he entered the room. He spoke to them in their native language, his voice gentle and patient. Mary climbed onto his lap while David leaned against his chair, both children clearly adoring their father. After Jacob left for his work in the fields, Elena began teaching Sarah about the household routines. They started with the vegetable garden, where Elena had cultivated beans, corn, squash, and various herbs. Sarah had helped with her father's small garden, but Elena's knowledge was far more extensive. The older woman explained which plants helped others grow, how to tell when vegetables were ready for harvest, and methods for preserving food through the winter months. The children followed them around the garden, with Mary picking flowers for a bouquet while David collected interesting rocks. Sarah watched how Elena interacted with her grandchildren, noting the perfect balance of affection and gentle guidance. When David started to wander toward the creek, Elena called him back with a story about water spirits that required respect and caution. The children listened with wide eyes, clearly familiar with their grandmother's tales. Throughout the morning, Sarah began to understand the household's rhythm. Elena rose early to start bread baking and prepare meals. The children had specific chores appropriate for their age: gathering eggs from the chickens, feeding scraps to the pigs, and keeping their room tidy. Jacob worked the land and cared for the larger animals, returning for meals and spending evenings with his family. Sarah's first challenge came when Elena announced she needed to visit her sister, who lived several miles away and had taken ill. This would leave Sarah alone with Mary and David for the entire afternoon, her first real test as their new stepmother. Elena seemed confident in Sarah's abilities, but Sarah felt nervous about managing two 6-year-old children without guidance. The afternoon began smoothly enough. Sarah prepared lunch while the children played quietly in their room. She had made simple sandwiches and found apples in the root cellar. Mary and David were polite during the meal, thanking her for the food and asking permission before leaving the table. Their good manners impressed Sarah and made her realize how well Elena and Jacob had raised them. After lunch, the real challenges began. David discovered a loose board on the front porch and decided to investigate, despite Sarah's instructions to stay in the yard. When she went to retrieve him, Mary disappeared into the house and emerged with flour from the kitchen, having decided to help by making bread. The flour covered not only Mary, but also a significant portion of the kitchen floor. Sarah felt overwhelmed as she tried to clean the flour mess while keeping track of David's whereabouts. This was much more difficult than caring for her father, who had been predictable and mostly self-sufficient. Children, she was learning, could create chaos in mere moments and required constant attention. The situation worsened when both children began arguing over a wooden toy horse. Their voices rose as each claimed ownership, and Sarah realized she had no idea how to resolve the dispute fairly. In her own childhood, her mother had handled such conflicts with ease, but Sarah felt unprepared for the complexities of child management. She tried to distract them with other activities, but this only led to new problems as they lost interest and found different ways to get into trouble. By the time Jacob returned from the fields, Sarah felt exhausted and discouraged. The kitchen still showed signs of the flour incident, despite her cleaning efforts. David had grass stains on his clothes from rolling down a hill, and Mary had tears in her eyes from a small scratch received while climbing a tree. Sarah was certain Jacob would regret his decision to marry her, as she clearly lacked the skills necessary to care for his children properly. However, Jacob's reaction surprised her. He listened patiently as she explained the afternoon's events, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. When she finished her account, he smiled and told her that Mary and David were testing her boundaries, something they did with anyone new in their lives. He assured her that such behavior was normal and would improve as the children grew more comfortable with her presence. That evening, Jacob helped Sarah understand more about his children's personalities and preferences. Mary was adventurous and creative, but sometimes impulsive in her decisions. David was curious and intelligent, but could become stubborn when he felt constrained. Both children missed their mother deeply, though they expressed their grief differently. Mary sometimes acted out to get attention, while David occasionally withdrew into himself. Jacob also shared stories about his late wife, Anna. She had been patient and loving with the children, but she had also struggled with their energy and mischief, especially when they were younger. He described times when Anna had felt overwhelmed and doubted her parenting abilities, making Sarah realize that her afternoon's challenges were not signs of failure, but normal parts of caring for children. As the days passed, Sarah began to develop her own approaches to managing the household and children. She discovered that Mary responded well to being given important tasks, such as helping with cooking or setting the table. David, meanwhile, enjoyed stories and would sit quietly when Sarah read to him from the few books the family owned. Both children liked routine and seemed more settled when they knew what to expect each day. Elena returned after 3 days, pleased to find the household running smoothly despite a few minor mishaps. She praised Sarah's efforts and offered additional advice about managing the children's behavior. The older woman had noticed positive changes already. The children were beginning to include Sarah in their conversations and had stopped referring to her as the new lady. One evening, Sarah experienced her first real breakthrough with Mary and David. A thunderstorm had frightened both children, and they came to her room seeking comfort. Without thinking, Sarah gathered them close and told them stories about brave children who weren't afraid of storms. Her voice was soothing, and gradually both children relaxed and fell asleep beside her. When Jacob found them the next morning, his expression showed surprise and gratitude. The daily work was demanding but rewarding. Sarah learned to milk the cow, churn butter, and preserve vegetables for winter storage. She discovered she had a talent for sewing and began mending the family's clothes and making new garments for the children. Elena taught her traditional recipes and methods for cooking game meat, skills that would prove valuable as autumn approached. Jacob began including Sarah in more household decisions, asking her opinion about purchases and planning for winter preparations. He treated her suggestions with respect and often implemented her ideas. Sarah realized that despite the arranged nature of their marriage, Jacob viewed her as a true partner rather than simply hired help. This recognition boosted her confidence and made her feel more secure in her new role. The relationship between Sarah and the children continued to strengthen. Mary began seeking Sarah's approval for her drawings and projects, while David started sharing his discoveries and interests with her. Both children seemed to understand that Sarah cared about their welfare and wanted to make them happy. They still missed their mother, but they were beginning to accept Sarah's place in their lives. As summer progressed toward autumn, Sarah felt more confident in her abilities and more at home in her new life. The work was hard, but she found satisfaction in contributing to the family's welfare and seeing the children thrive under her care. Jacob's quiet appreciation for her efforts encouraged her, and Elena's continued guidance helped her improve her skills. The future still held uncertainties, but Sarah began to believe she could succeed in this new life. 3 months into her marriage, Sarah noticed changes in Jacob that puzzled her. He would disappear for hours without explanation, claiming he needed to check on distant cattle or repair fences. Sometimes she caught him staring into the distance with an expression she couldn't read, as if he was listening for something only he could hear. When she asked about these absences, his answers were vague and unsatisfying. Elena seemed to know more than she was saying. The older woman would exchange meaningful glances with Jacob during his unexplained departures, and Sarah sensed an understanding between them that excluded her. This secrecy troubled Sarah, not because she suspected anything improper, but because she thought their relationship had grown beyond such mysteries. She had begun to care deeply for Jacob, and his withdrawal felt like rejection. The children also noticed their father's strange behavior. Mary asked Sarah why Papa seemed sad sometimes, and David mentioned that he heard voices outside at night. Sarah assured them that their father was fine, but privately she wondered what could be causing these changes. Jacob remained kind and respectful toward her, but the emotional distance was growing, creating an invisible barrier between them. One evening, Sarah decided to confront the situation directly. After the children were asleep and Elena had retired to her room, she found Jacob sitting on the front porch staring at the stars. The autumn air was crisp, and she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before joining him on the wooden steps. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the countryside. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was gentle but determined. She told Jacob that she sensed something was troubling him, and offered to help if she could. She explained that his mysterious behavior was affecting the entire family, including the children who worried about their father's apparent sadness. She assured him that whatever burden he carried, she was strong enough to share it. Jacob's response was unexpected. He turned to look at her with eyes full of pain and said that there were things about his past that she wouldn't understand. He spoke about responsibilities and obligations that went beyond the family's daily needs. When Sarah pressed for more details, he stood abruptly and went inside, leaving her alone with her questions and growing concern. The next few days brought an escalation of Jacob's mysterious activities. He began leaving before dawn and returning after dark, often looking exhausted and troubled. Elena took over more of his usual farm duties, working alongside Sarah to maintain the household and care for the livestock. The older woman's silence about Jacob's behavior became more frustrating, especially when Sarah realized that Elena was clearly worried about her son's well-being. Sarah's breaking point came when Jacob returned one night with torn clothes and scratches on his hands and face. He claimed to have fallen while checking a fence line, but his explanation didn't account for the extent of his injuries or the strange, haunted look in his eyes. Sarah insisted on cleaning his wounds, and as she tended to him, she noticed that his hands were shaking and he seemed to be fighting some internal battle. That night, Sarah heard voices outside the house. At first, she thought Jacob was talking to someone, but when she looked out her window, she saw him standing alone in the yard, apparently having a conversation with empty air. His posture and gestures suggested he was arguing with someone, his voice too low for her to make out the words. The sight frightened her, and she wondered if Jacob might be suffering from some kind of mental illness. The following morning, Elena found Sarah in the kitchen, clearly upset and exhausted from worry. The older woman took one look at Sarah's face and seemed to make a decision. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down at the table, gesturing for Sarah to join her. When they were both seated, Elena began to speak in slow, careful English, choosing her words deliberately. Elena explained that Jacob carried a burden that was both a gift and a curse. She spoke about ancient responsibilities that were passed down through certain family lines, duties that couldn't be abandoned without serious consequences. The older woman's words were cryptic, but Sarah began to understand that Jacob's mysterious behavior was connected to his cultural heritage and spiritual beliefs. According to Elena, Jacob had inherited the ability to communicate with spirits of the dead, particularly those who had unfinished business or needed guidance to find peace. This gift had manifested itself shortly after Anna's death, when her spirit had lingered to ensure that Mary and David would be properly cared for. What had started as communication with his late wife had expanded to include other spirits who sought his help. Sarah listened with growing amazement and concern. Elena explained that Jacob had tried to ignore his abilities at first, hoping they would fade with time. However, the spirits had become more insistent, appearing to him at all hours and making demands on his time and energy. Some were peaceful and simply needed reassurance, while others were angry or confused, requiring more intensive help to find their way to the afterlife. The burden was wearing Jacob down physically and emotionally. Elena had tried to help by teaching him traditional methods for managing such gifts, including protective rituals and ways to limit his availability to the spirit world. However, Jacob's abilities were stronger than normal, and the spirits were drawn to him from great distances. His reputation as a spiritual guide was spreading among both the living and the dead. Elena made Sarah promise to keep this information secret, explaining that many people, both white and native, would not understand Jacob's abilities. Some would fear him, others would seek to exploit his gifts, and still others would dismiss him as mentally unstable. The family's safety and security depended on maintaining discretion about Jacob's spiritual work. That evening, when Jacob returned from another mysterious absence, Sarah was waiting for him. She told him that Elena had explained about his abilities, and she wanted him to know that she wasn't frightened or judgmental. Instead, she was concerned about the toll this burden was taking on his health and their family relationships. She offered to support him however she could, whether that meant taking on additional household responsibilities or simply providing a sympathetic ear when he needed to talk. Jacob's relief was visible. He had been carrying the secret alone, afraid that Sarah would leave if she knew the truth about his supernatural abilities. He explained that Anna's spirit had actually approved of their marriage, appearing to him shortly after the wedding to express her gratitude that someone kind and capable would care for her children. This revelation both comforted and unsettled Sarah, knowing that her predecessor had observed and judged her from beyond the grave. Over the following weeks, Jacob began sharing more details about his spiritual encounters. He described helping a young soldier find peace after dying far from home, assisting an elderly woman in locating important papers her family needed, and convincing a confused spirit to stop frightening a neighboring family's children. Each case required different approaches and varying amounts of time and energy. Sarah learned to recognize the signs that indicated Jacob was needed elsewhere. His behavior would become restless and distracted, and he would often mention strange dreams or feelings of urgency. She began managing the household more independently during these times, ensuring that the children's routines remained stable, even when their father was called away on spiritual missions. The children remained unaware of their father's abilities, though Sarah suspected that Mary, in particular, might be developing similar gifts. The little girl sometimes spoke about seeing people that no one else could see, and she had an uncanny ability to know when someone was sad or troubled. Elena watched Mary carefully, teaching her traditional songs and stories that might help her understand any abilities that emerged as she grew older. Sarah's relationship with Jacob deepened as she became his confidant and support system. She learned to prepare special teas that Elena recommended for spiritual protection, and she created a quiet space in their home where Jacob could rest and recover after particularly difficult encounters with the spirit world. Her practical nature helped ground him when the supernatural demands threatened to overwhelm his connection to the physical world. The community around them remained unaware of Jacob's abilities, seeing only a hardworking farmer with a new wife and loving family. Sarah helped maintain this facade by ensuring that their daily lives appeared completely normal to outside observers. She became skilled at explaining Jacob's absences in ways that satisfied neighbors' curiosity, without revealing the true nature of his work. As autumn progressed toward winter, Sarah realized that she had not only accepted Jacob's supernatural burden, but had become an essential part of managing it. Her presence in his life provided stability and normalcy that helped him maintain his connection to the living world, while fulfilling his obligations to the dead. Their arranged marriage had evolved into a true partnership built on trust, understanding, and shared responsibility for challenges that few people could even imagine. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested Sarah's new understanding of her husband's abilities. The cold seemed to intensify Jacob's connection to the spirit world, as if the veil between the living and dead grew thinner with each snowfall. Spirits appeared more frequently, their needs more urgent and their demands on Jacob's time more pressing than ever before. Sarah learned to read the signs that preceded these supernatural encounters. Jacob would become restless and unable to sleep, pacing the house in the early morning hours. His appetite would disappear, and he would stare out windows as if seeing things invisible to others. Most telling were the moments when he would suddenly stop mid-conversation, his head tilted as if listening to voices only he could hear. The first major incident of winter involved a tragedy that had occurred decades earlier. A family of travelers had become lost in a blizzard not far from Jacob's property, freezing to death before help could reach them. Their spirits had been wandering the area ever since, confused and seeking the way home they never found in life. Jacob discovered them during one of his unexplained absences, drawn by their desperate calls for help. For 3 days, Jacob worked to help these lost souls find peace. He would leave the house before dawn and return after dark, exhausted and drained. Sarah watched him grow thinner and more haggard with each passing day, his normally steady hands beginning to shake from the spiritual exertion. Elena prepared special foods and teas designed to restore his energy, but even her traditional remedies seemed insufficient against such a prolonged spiritual ordeal. Sarah felt helpless watching Jacob struggle with this burden. She increased her household responsibilities, ensuring that the children's needs were met and the farm work continued despite Jacob's unavailability. Mary and David sensed the tension in the house, becoming quieter than usual and staying closer to Sarah for comfort. She read to them more frequently and created new games to distract them from their father's obvious distress. The situation reached a crisis point when Jacob collapsed in the barn after returning from his 3rd day with the lost spirits. Sarah found him there unconscious and burning with fever. With Elena's help, she carried him to the house and put him to bed, where he remained delirious for 2 days. During his illness, he spoke constantly to people who weren't there, sometimes arguing, sometimes pleading, occasionally laughing at conversations only he could hear. Elena worked tirelessly to break Jacob's fever, using traditional medicines and spiritual practices passed down through generations. She burned special herbs in his room and sang ancient songs designed to strengthen his connection to the living world. Sarah stayed by his bedside, cooling his forehead with damp cloths and forcing small amounts of broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. During Jacob's illness, Sarah experienced her first direct encounter with the supernatural. On the 2nd night of his fever, she woke to find a woman standing beside his bed. The figure was translucent and glowing with a soft light, her clothes suggesting she was from an earlier era. Sarah's heart pounded with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm and quiet, not wanting to disturb Jacob's rest. The spirit woman looked at Sarah with sad, desperate eyes and began to speak, though no sound emerged from her lips. Somehow Sarah understood that this was one of the lost travelers, and she was begging for help in reaching Jacob. Sarah whispered that Jacob was too ill to help anyone right now, and the spirit would need to wait until he recovered. The woman nodded sadly and faded away, leaving Sarah shaken but strangely proud that she had handled the encounter without panic. When Jacob finally recovered from his fever, he was different. The spiritual ordeal had changed him, leaving him more sensitive to supernatural influences but also more skilled at managing them. He explained to Sarah that helping the lost family had required him to partially enter their realm, a dangerous process that had nearly trapped him between the world of the living and the dead. Only Elena's intervention and Sarah's constant presence had kept him anchored to life. The experience taught Sarah more about the true extent of Jacob's abilities and the very real dangers he faced. She began insisting that he take better precautions before engaging with particularly powerful or desperate spirits. Elena taught her protective rituals she could perform to help shield Jacob during his spiritual work, giving Sarah a way to actively support him rather than simply waiting and worrying. As winter deepened, the demands on Jacob's abilities continued to increase. Word of his gifts spread through the spiritual realm faster than it did among the living, drawing spirits from greater distances who sought his help. Some were recent deaths who needed guidance finding their way to the afterlife. Others were ancient souls who had been trapped by unfinished business for generations. Each case presented unique challenges and required different approaches. Sarah became Jacob's partner in ways she had never expected. She learned to prepare the house for spiritual visitations, creating safe spaces where Jacob could work without endangering the family. She studied Elena's protective rituals and became skilled at recognizing when supernatural forces were present. Most importantly, she became Jacob's anchor to the physical world, a constant reminder of his responsibilities to the living. The children began to notice changes in their father's behavior, though they didn't understand the cause. Mary asked Sarah why Papa sometimes talked to empty rooms, and David mentioned that he sometimes felt like someone was watching him. Sarah worked to maintain normalcy in their daily routines while protecting them from the more frightening aspects of their father's abilities. One evening, Sarah discovered that Mary might be developing supernatural sensitivity of her own. The little girl approached her after dinner, asking why the sad lady in the kitchen was crying. When Sarah looked, she saw nothing, but Jacob's immediate attention to Mary's words suggested that a spirit was indeed present. This development concerned everyone, as they had hoped the children would not inherit Jacob's burdensome gifts. Elena began working more closely with Mary, teaching her traditional stories and songs that might help her understand any abilities that emerged. The older woman explained that such gifts often appeared in childhood, but could be managed and controlled with proper guidance. She stressed the importance of helping Mary develop strong connections to the living world to prevent her from becoming lost in the supernatural realm. Sarah found herself mediating between Jacob's spiritual responsibilities and the family's daily needs. She learned to schedule important activities around his supernatural work, ensuring that family meals and time with the children weren't constantly interrupted by spirit encounters. She also became skilled at explaining his absences to concerned neighbors without revealing the true nature of his activities. The winter brought financial concerns as well. Jacob's spiritual work often prevented him from completing necessary farm tasks, and the family's resources began to stretch thin. Sarah took on additional responsibilities, learning to care for livestock in harsh weather and managing household finances more carefully. She also began taking in sewing work from neighboring families, using her domestic skills to supplement their income. Despite the challenges, Sarah found unexpected fulfillment in her role as Jacob's spiritual partner. She discovered that she had a natural ability to create calm, protective environments that enhanced Jacob's work. Her practical nature provided balance to his supernatural experiences, helping him maintain perspective and avoid becoming completely absorbed in the spirit world. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement, was evolving into a deep partnership built on mutual support and shared extraordinary experiences. As winter progressed toward spring, Sarah realized that she had not only accepted Jacob's supernatural burden, but had become an essential part of his ability to manage it safely. Her presence in his life provided the stability and grounding he needed to serve the spirit world without losing himself in it. Their family had found a way to function despite challenges that would have destroyed most marriages, and Sarah felt proud of the strength and adaptability she had discovered within herself. Spring brought new challenges and revelations that would forever change Sarah's understanding of her place in Jacob's world. As the snow melted and the earth began to warm, the spiritual activity around their homestead intensified dramatically. Jacob explained that spring was a time of transition, when many souls who had been waiting through the winter would finally seek resolution for their earthly concerns. The first sign that this spring would be different came when Mary began having vivid dreams about people she had never met. She would wake up crying, describing detailed conversations with children who said they were lost and couldn't find their parents. Elena took these dreams very seriously, explaining to Sarah that the little girl was beginning to develop the same abilities as her father, though in a different form. Sarah felt overwhelmed by this development. Caring for Jacob during his supernatural encounters was demanding enough, but the thought of Mary also being drawn into the spirit world filled her with protective fear. She found herself watching the child constantly, looking for signs that the supernatural influences were becoming too strong or too frightening for a 6-year-old to handle. Jacob shared Sarah's concerns about Mary's emerging abilities. He remembered his own childhood experiences with spirits and knew how frightening and confusing they could be, without proper guidance. He began spending more time with Mary, teaching her simple protective rituals and helping her understand that not all supernatural encounters were dangerous. Most importantly, he emphasized that she should always tell an adult when spirits tried to communicate with her. The situation became more complicated when David also began showing signs of supernatural sensitivity. Unlike Mary's dream communications, David's abilities manifested as an uncanny knowledge of things he shouldn't know. He would mention details about neighbors' private lives or predict events before they happened. His insights were often startlingly accurate, suggesting that he was receiving information from supernatural sources. Elena explained that having both children develop spiritual abilities was extremely rare and potentially dangerous. She worried that their combined power might attract more spirits than Jacob could safely manage, overwhelming the family's ability to maintain normal lives. The older woman began teaching both children more intensive protective practices while urging Sarah and Jacob to consider seeking help from other spiritual practitioners in the community. Sarah's own role in the family's supernatural activities continued to evolve. She discovered that her presence during Jacob's spiritual work seemed to strengthen his abilities while providing protection against the more dangerous aspects of spirit communication. Elena suggested that Sarah might have latent abilities of her own, though they manifested differently than Jacob's direct communication with the dead. One evening, Sarah experienced her most significant supernatural encounter yet. While Jacob was helping a spirit in the barn, Sarah remained in the house with the sleeping children. She was mending clothes by lamplight when she became aware that someone was watching her. Looking up, she saw a young woman standing near the fireplace, her appearance suggesting she had died decades earlier. Instead of fear, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm. The spirit woman seemed familiar somehow, though Sarah was certain they had never met. The woman gestured toward the children's room, her expression urgent but not threatening. Without understanding why, Sarah found herself following the spirit upstairs, moving quietly to avoid waking Mary and David. In the children's room, Sarah discovered that David was having what appeared to be a nightmare. He was tossing restlessly and whimpering in his sleep, his small face scrunched with distress. The spirit woman pointed to the boy and then to herself, and suddenly Sarah understood. This spirit was trying to protect David from something that was frightening him in his dreams. Sarah gently woke David, who immediately threw his arms around her and sobbed about scary people who were trying to take him away. As she comforted the child, Sarah noticed that the spirit woman was no longer alone. Several other figures had appeared in the room, their presence creating a protective circle around David's bed. Sarah realized that these spirits were acting as guardians, shielding the boy from more malevolent supernatural forces that sought to exploit his developing abilities. When Jacob returned from the barn, he found Sarah sitting with both children, who had awakened during David's distress. She quickly explained what had happened, and Jacob's expression grew grave. He told her that David's abilities were attracting attention from spirits who weren't necessarily benevolent, and the protective spirits had intervened to keep him safe. This incident marked a turning point in Sarah's relationship with the supernatural world. She began to understand that her role wasn't just to support Jacob, but to actively participate in protecting their family from spiritual dangers. Elena started teaching her more advanced protective techniques, including how to create barriers around the house and how to recognize different types of spiritual entities. As spring progressed, the family developed new routines designed to manage the increased supernatural activity. Jacob would conduct his most intensive spiritual work during daylight hours, when the children were occupied with outdoor activities. Sarah learned to create distraction activities that kept Mary and David engaged, while their father dealt with particularly demanding spirits. The children's abilities continued to develop, but under careful guidance, they learned to manage their supernatural encounters more effectively. Mary discovered that she could choose whether to respond to spirits in her dreams, giving her some control over these nocturnal communications. David learned simple protective prayers that Elena taught him, which seemed to reduce the frequency of unwanted spiritual contact. Sarah found herself becoming more confident in dealing with supernatural situations. She developed an intuitive sense for when spirits were present and learned to distinguish between those seeking help and those who might pose a threat. Her practical nature proved invaluable in creating systems for managing the family's complex spiritual and physical needs. The community around them remained unaware of the family's supernatural activities, though Sarah noticed that some neighbors seemed to sense something unusual about their household. Children from nearby farms would sometimes refuse to play near their property, and adults occasionally made comments about strange feelings or unexplained phenomena in the area. One particularly challenging situation arose when a powerful spirit began demanding Jacob's attention at all hours of the day and night. This entity was different from the usual lost souls seeking guidance. It was angry and aggressive, apparently unwilling to move on to whatever awaited it after death. Jacob's attempts to help this spirit left him exhausted and increasingly agitated. Sarah recognized that this situation was beyond Jacob's ability to handle alone. She convinced him to seek help from other spiritual practitioners in the region, despite his reluctance to reveal his abilities to strangers. Elena arranged a meeting with an elderly medicine man who had experience dealing with particularly difficult spirits. The medicine man's visit revealed new dimensions to Jacob's abilities that even Elena hadn't fully understood. He explained that Jacob's gift was exceptionally strong enough to attract spirits from great distances and even across tribal boundaries. This power came with both great responsibility and significant danger, as it could draw the attention of entities that were better left undisturbed. Working together, Jacob and the medicine man were able to resolve the situation with the aggressive spirit. But the experience taught the family important lessons about the need for proper spiritual protection and the importance of seeking help when dealing with forces beyond their understanding. Sarah felt grateful for the expanded network of support, knowing that her family's safety depended on more than just their individual efforts. As spring turned toward summer, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since her arrival at the homestead. She had not only adapted to the challenges of caring for Jacob's children and managing a frontier household, but she had also become an integral part of dealing with supernatural responsibilities that few people could even imagine. Her marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement, had evolved into a partnership that encompassed both the mundane challenges of daily life and the extraordinary demands of the spirit world. The children were thriving, despite the unusual circumstances of their upbringing. Mary's supernatural sensitivity was being channeled into helpful directions, and she was learning to use her abilities to assist rather than be frightened by them. David was developing better control over his spiritual encounters, and his natural intelligence was helping him understand and manage his experiences. Sarah realized that she had found her place not just in Jacob's family, but in a larger community of people who understood and dealt with supernatural phenomena. Her role as a bridge between the ordinary world and the spirit realm had given her a sense of purpose she had never expected to find. As she looked toward the future, she felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, her family had the strength and support necessary to face them together. Summer brought an unexpected visitor who would reveal the full extent of Jacob's secret and change everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband's past. The stranger arrived on a hot July afternoon, riding a worn horse and carrying minimal supplies. He was a native man about Jacob's age, with weathered features and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Elena recognized the visitor immediately, though her reaction was complex, part welcome, part worry. She greeted him in their native language, and Sarah noticed the urgency in their conversation. The man's name was Thomas Running Bear, and he had traveled many days to reach Jacob. His presence suggested that Jacob's reputation as a spiritual guide had spread far beyond their local area. Jacob's reaction to Thomas's arrival was even more revealing. Sarah had never seen her husband display such a mixture of joy and apprehension. The two men embraced like old friends, but their subsequent conversation was intense and serious. Sarah realized that Thomas's visit wasn't social, but related to some significant spiritual crisis that required Jacob's immediate attention. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas explained his situation to the family. He spoke of a terrible tragedy that had occurred in his community several weeks earlier. A group of children had drowned in a river accident, and their spirits were unable to find peace. The local spiritual leaders had tried to help, but the children's fear and confusion were too strong for conventional methods to reach them. Thomas had heard about Jacob's exceptional abilities from other spiritual practitioners who had encountered spirits that Jacob had successfully guided to peace. He was asking Jacob to travel back with him, despite the considerable distance and the dangers involved in such powerful spiritual work. The journey would take weeks, and Jacob would be dealing with multiple traumatized spirits simultaneously. Sarah felt her heart sink as she listened to Thomas's request. She understood the importance of Jacob's work, but the thought of him traveling so far from home to deal with such dangerous spiritual forces filled her with dread. She had seen how exhausted Jacob became after helping even a single troubled spirit, and this situation involved multiple child spirits in extreme distress. Jacob was clearly torn between his sense of duty and his responsibilities to his own family. He explained to Thomas that his situation had become more complicated since his marriage, as he now had Sarah and the children to consider in addition to his spiritual obligations. He also mentioned the developing abilities in Mary and David, which required careful monitoring and guidance. Elena surprised everyone by supporting Jacob's involvement in the mission. She explained that refusing to help in such a serious situation could have spiritual consequences that might affect their entire family. The spirits of traumatized children were particularly powerful and could cause problems across great distances if their distress remained unresolved. Furthermore, Jacob's reputation in the spiritual community depended on his willingness to respond to truly serious crises. Sarah found herself in the difficult position of having to support a decision that terrified her. She understood that Jacob's abilities came with obligations he couldn't simply ignore, but she also knew that this mission represented the greatest risk he had ever undertaken. The thought of losing him to the spirit world, leaving her alone with two supernaturally sensitive children, was almost overwhelming. The family spent several days preparing for Jacob's departure. Elena worked tirelessly to create protective charms and spiritual safeguards for the journey. Sarah packed supplies and ensured that Jacob had everything he might need for an extended absence. Most importantly, they developed plans for managing the household and the children's supernatural experiences while he was away. Mary and David sensed the gravity of the situation. Though they didn't fully understand what their father would be doing, Sarah explained that Papa had to help some children who were lost and scared, which was true enough without revealing the supernatural details. Both children promised to be good and help Sarah while their father was away. The night before Jacob's departure, he and Sarah had their most honest conversation yet about his abilities and their implications for their marriage. Jacob revealed that he had been born with these gifts but had tried to suppress them during his first marriage, because Anna had been frightened by supernatural phenomena. Only after Anna's death had he fully embraced his abilities, partly because her spirit had insisted that he accept his calling. Jacob also confessed that he had been worried about Sarah's reaction to his gifts, fearing that she might leave him if she knew the full extent of his supernatural involvement. Her acceptance and support had meant more to him than she could know, and her practical assistance had made it possible for him to serve the spirit world while maintaining a stable family life. Sarah assured Jacob that she understood the importance of his work and would support him regardless of the personal cost. She had come to realize that his abilities weren't just a burden, but a genuine calling to help souls in distress. Her role was to provide the stability and grounding that allowed him to do this important work safely. The morning of Jacob's departure was emotional for the entire family. Thomas waited patiently while Jacob said goodbye to each family member individually. He spent extra time with Mary and David, giving them special protective charms and making them promise to stay close to Sarah and Elena while he was away. His farewell to Sarah was particularly difficult, as both of them understood that this mission carried unusual risks. After Jacob and Thomas rode away, Sarah faced the challenge of maintaining family routines while managing her own anxiety about her husband's safety. She kept the children busy with projects and activities, ensuring that their daily lives remained as normal as possible despite their father's absence. Elena provided crucial support, helping with household tasks and keeping watch for any signs of supernatural activity around the property. The first few days passed quietly, but then strange things began happening around the homestead. Sarah would hear children's laughter when Mary and David were asleep, and she sometimes caught glimpses of small figures playing in the yard. Elena explained that Jacob's mission was affecting the spiritual environment around their home, as the distressed child spirits were somehow reaching across the distance to seek additional help. Mary's dreams became more intense during Jacob's absence, filled with visions of children crying for their parents and begging for help finding their way home. Sarah had to wake her daughter several times to comfort her, after particularly disturbing nightmares. David, meanwhile, began speaking about invisible playmates who seemed sad and scared, clearly describing the same child spirits that Mary was encountering in her dreams. Elena worked constantly to maintain spiritual protection around the house and family. She burned protective herbs, sang traditional songs, and performed rituals designed to shield them from the supernatural disturbances radiating from Jacob's distant work. Despite her efforts, the spiritual activity continued to increase, suggesting that Jacob was dealing with an extremely difficult situation. After 2 weeks with no word from Jacob, Sarah began to seriously worry about his safety. Elena tried to reassure her, explaining that such spiritual work often took longer than expected and that communication over long distances was difficult. However, Sarah could see that the older woman was also concerned about the prolonged silence and the increasing supernatural activity around their home. The situation reached a crisis point when both Mary and David began seeing the distressed child spirits during their waking hours. The children would point to empty spaces and describe seeing scared children who wanted to go home. Sarah found herself dealing with supernatural phenomena that she had never experienced before, trying to comfort and protect her children while managing her own fear and uncertainty. Elena finally decided that they needed to seek help from other spiritual practitioners in the area. She sent messages to several medicine men and women, asking them to provide additional protection for Jacob's family while he completed his dangerous mission. The response was immediate and supportive, demonstrating the respect that Jacob commanded in the spiritual community and the concern that his colleagues felt for his welfare. As the 3rd week of Jacob's absence began, Sarah realized that this experience was testing every aspect of her commitment to her husband and her new family. She was learning to manage supernatural crises that would have terrified her a year earlier, while maintaining her children's safety and emotional stability. The woman who had once worried about managing 2 mischievous 6-year-olds was now protecting them from distressed spirits and coordinating with spiritual practitioners across the region. Jacob returned home on a rainy evening in late July, arriving unexpectedly after 3 weeks of absence. Sarah saw him first through the kitchen window, riding slowly up the path with Thomas beside him. Both men looked exhausted beyond measure, their clothes torn and their faces gaunt from the ordeal they had endured. Sarah's relief at seeing Jacob alive was immediately tempered by concern for his obvious physical and emotional distress. The reunion was both joyful and sobering. Mary and David threw themselves into their father's arms, clinging to him as if afraid he might disappear again. Jacob held them close, but Sarah could see that he was struggling to return fully to the world of the living. His eyes held a distant quality, as if part of him remained connected to the spiritual realm where he had been working. Thomas stayed only long enough to rest his horse and share a brief meal before continuing his journey home. Before leaving, he spoke privately with Elena and Sarah, explaining that Jacob had accomplished something unprecedented in the spiritual community. The mission to help the drowned children had been successful, but it had required Jacob to take extraordinary risks that had pushed his abilities to their absolute limits. According to Thomas, Jacob had essentially entered the realm of the dead to reach the terrified child spirits, something that few spiritual practitioners had ever attempted, and fewer still had survived. The experience had saved the children's souls but had left Jacob fundamentally changed. Thomas warned that it might take considerable time for Jacob to fully readjust to life in the physical world. Elena immediately began working to help Jacob recover from his spiritual ordeal. She prepared special foods designed to strengthen his connection to the earthly realm and performed traditional ceremonies meant to cleanse him of residual spiritual influences from his journey into the realm of the dead. Despite her efforts, Jacob remained distant and disconnected, as if he was having difficulty remembering how to exist fully in the world of the living. Sarah found herself taking on the role of Jacob's primary anchor to reality. She stayed close to him constantly, talking about practical matters and everyday concerns that reminded him of his earthly responsibilities. She involved him in simple household tasks and encouraged him to spend time with Mary and David, using his love for his children to strengthen his connection to life. The children were both fascinated and frightened by their father's condition. Mary, with her developing spiritual sensitivity, seemed to understand that Papa had been somewhere far away and was having trouble coming back completely. David, meanwhile, was confused by his father's distant behavior and kept asking Sarah why Papa seemed different. Elena explained to Sarah that Jacob's condition, while concerning, was not entirely unexpected given the magnitude of what he had accomplished. She had seen similar effects in other powerful spiritual practitioners who had undertaken extremely dangerous missions. The key was patience and consistent efforts to remind Jacob of his earthly connections and responsibilities. As the days passed, Sarah began to see gradual improvements in Jacob's condition. He started participating more actively in conversations and showing greater interest in the farm work that had been neglected during his absence. However, he also seemed to have gained new spiritual abilities as a result of his journey into the realm of the dead. He could now perceive spirits with greater clarity and seemed to have an enhanced understanding of the spiritual world. One significant change was that Jacob could now see the spirits that had been troubling Mary and David during his absence. He immediately began working to resolve the situation, guiding the lingering child spirits to peace with a gentleness and effectiveness that impressed even Elena. Sarah realized that Jacob's traumatic experience had somehow enhanced his abilities while also making him more vulnerable to spiritual influences. The family developed new routines designed to help Jacob maintain his balance between the spiritual and physical worlds. Sarah insisted that he spend specific amounts of time each day focused on purely earthly activities, working with the livestock, playing with the children, or helping with household tasks. These activities served as anchors that kept him connected to his life as a husband and father. Elena began teaching Sarah more advanced spiritual protection techniques, recognizing that Jacob's enhanced abilities meant that the family would face greater supernatural challenges in the future. Sarah learned to create protective barriers around their property and to perform rituals that would shield Jacob when his spiritual work threatened to overwhelm his connection to the living world. The children's supernatural abilities continued to develop, but now Jacob was better equipped to guide them through these experiences. His journey into the realm of the dead had given him insights into managing spiritual gifts that he shared with Mary and David. He taught them advanced protection techniques and helped them understand that their abilities were gifts to be used responsibly rather than burdens to be feared. As autumn approached, the family settled into a new normal that accommodated Jacob's enhanced abilities while maintaining the stability that Sarah and the children needed. Jacob's reputation in the spiritual community had grown significantly as word of his successful mission spread, bringing requests for help from even greater distances. However, he became more selective about which cases he accepted, recognizing the importance of maintaining his earthly connections. Sarah found that her own role in the family's supernatural activities had evolved as well. She had developed intuitive abilities that complemented Jacob's direct spiritual communication, and she became skilled at managing the practical aspects of his spiritual work. Her presence during his supernatural encounters provided crucial grounding that helped him maintain his safety and effectiveness. The community around them remained largely unaware of the family's supernatural activities, though Sarah noticed that their neighbors seemed to have greater respect for Jacob and often sought his advice on matters that weren't obviously related to his farming expertise. She realized that people sensed something special about her husband, even if they didn't understand the nature of his gifts. One evening in late autumn, as Sarah was putting the children to bed, Mary asked her if Papa would always be different now. Sarah considered the question carefully before explaining that Papa had helped some very scared children find their way home, and that experience had changed him in ways that made him even better at helping people who needed spiritual guidance. She assured Mary that despite the changes, Papa's love for his family remained exactly the same. David, with his characteristic directness, asked Sarah if she was scared of Papa's abilities. Sarah answered honestly that sometimes the spiritual world could be frightening, but she wasn't afraid of Papa because she knew he used his gifts to help people. She explained that being part of their family meant accepting that they were different from most families. But that being different wasn't necessarily bad. As winter approached again, Sarah reflected on the remarkable changes in her life since her marriage to Jacob. She had evolved from a practical young woman, focused on basic survival, into someone who could navigate both the mundane challenges of frontier life and the extraordinary demands of the supernatural world. Her arranged marriage had become a true partnership built on shared responsibilities that few couples could even imagine. Jacob's secret had turned out to be far more complex and significant than Sarah could have anticipated. What had seemed like a simple burden to be managed had revealed itself as a profound calling that affected not only Jacob, but their entire family. Sarah had not only accepted this reality, but had become an essential part of making it work safely and effectively. Looking toward the future, Sarah felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, her family had the strength, knowledge, and support necessary to face them. Her children were learning to manage their own supernatural gifts with wisdom and responsibility. Jacob had found the balance between his spiritual calling and his earthly responsibilities. Most importantly, they had created a home where the extraordinary was simply part of their normal life, where love and practical support enabled them to serve purposes larger than themselves while maintaining the bonds that made them a family. The arranged marriage that had begun with uncertainty and practical necessity had evolved into something far deeper and more meaningful than Sarah had ever expected. She had found not only a place in Jacob's family, but a purpose that utilized all of her strengths and challenged her to grow in ways she never could have imagined. As she watched the first snow of winter begin to fall, Sarah felt grateful for the journey that had brought her to this remarkable life and ready for whatever adventures the future might hold.